Our presentations today is Eliot Siegel is going to talk to us about imaging and image management. Eliot?
Thanks. Good afternoon, and thanks very much for the invitation to share a little bit of the experience that we have and some of the insights that we've gained by looking pretty carefully into the whole question of image information overload. And I'm going to be specifically talking about medical imaging. I am a radiologist, but I think that a lot of the topics that we're talking about really apply to healthcare in general. This whole idea of having just more and more information at one's fingertips is great, but the contrapositive to that is the problem of trying to figure out how to deal with all that tremendous amount of information. National statistics suggest that radiologists are reading more studies than ever before. And there are dire radiology shortages across the United States and many other countries. And the challenge is to read studies without a sacrifice in quality. Just the other day, I put myself on the CT rotation. I mainly do body MR and nuclear medicine, but I do CT also. And this is sort of, I think, a metaphor of how I felt reading, I think it was 70-plus CTs, had 4 biopsies, and a number of ultrasounds and MR studies. And I think this is a metaphor for what's been going on in radiology in the last few years.
All right, girls. Now, this is your last test. If one piece of candy gets past you and into the packing room unwrapped, you're fired.
This is one of my favorite movies. An episode called Job Switching. So they're at the candy factory. Radiology is like in 1994.
Well, this is easier. Yeah, we can handle this, okay?
Here we are with the
Listen, I think we're fighting a losing game. Fine, you're doing splendidly. Speed it up!
I'll go ahead and stop there for now. So what we've seen is a really interesting paradigm shift as we made the transition from film-based to filmless operation back in 1993. What we found first was with film, there are a number of things that one can do. You can zoom and pan by putting on a little pair of binocular glasses and do some edge enhancement by holding the film up, but your options are really very limited with film. Once we made the transition to soft copy, we found that most of the radiologists begin looking at images as though they were just films on a monitor. And they end up still being in this very static mode, which is what we radiologists many years ago were sort of trained in. Put the image in front of us, we'll figure out what it is, say something into a microphone, and then we'll step on the pedal and a whole bunch of new images will come up. And that paradigm is shifting. What the next phase is we go sort of into this soft copy static mode where radiologists begin figuring out it's not film and that we have the capability of doing some windowing and leveling and modifying the images a little bit. And then radiologists eventually learn to do a lot of these functions automatically. And then we move to the next phase, which is sort of stack mode, where we learn for CT and many other modalities that we can take multiple images, stack them on top of each other. And the human visual system is actually built to detect motion. And there's some higher order sensors that are built into your visual system that allow one to be able to take advantage of stack mode and be able to see a nodule or a change or connect vessels much more efficiently than one could do in static mode. A number of studies have documented that stack mode increases both interpretation efficiency as well as accuracy. And this fifth phase that I'm going to focus on is sort of this phase of volumetric imaging, where what's happened with CT, and we can talk about other modalities in a moment, is we've gotten to a point where we can scan fast enough and slice thin enough, around 0.7 or 0.8 millimeters or less. We can get isotropic imaging, which means that we can reconstruct a CT data set now in any plane that we want to. It was an accident that patients end up fitting into the CT scanner so that we scan them in the axial plane. We've all learned axial anatomy, but there's no reason now, the way the CT scanners are able to acquire the information, there's no one plane that's necessarily any better than another, and it could be that the coronal and sagittal and oblique planes are significantly better for certain types of pathology. And so what we've done is we've moved to a new paradigm, which is instead of having the radiologists be presented with static images, the radiologist becomes much more of a navigator and an explorer through the data set. The amount of data in a single pathology slide, to use the analogy between radiology and pathology, is tremendous. We didn't really talk about telepathology today, but if we had to take a slide which contains information in multiple depths and very, very high resolution data, it would be the equivalent potentially of hundreds or thousands of multi-channel CT scanners. Pathologists are used to interacting with the slide and looking at different depths. Radiologists are going to need to behave much more like pathologists, exploring a data set from many different perspectives at many different levels. CT scanners, as I mentioned, have acquired images in the axial plane, but we're now freed up to be able to take information that we acquire from CT and other modalities and interact with the data. And a number of studies that we and others have done have documented that that capability significantly increases our ability to make an earlier or more accurate diagnosis. What we're finding, though, is that stack mode is not adequate anymore to review the 300 to 500 images that we acquire today just for a routine CT of the thorax, less so for 1,500 to 2,000 images that we do for a CTA runoff study. This is data from Rick Moran, who's at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville. And what he found was in 1994, the daily number of CT images per radiologist was about 1,500 images per day. That's in 94. Which is about 24 seconds per CT image if he actually gets his radiologist to put in a 10-hour workday with no breaks. In 2002, the figure was 16,000 CT images per day per radiologist, about 2 seconds per image. And he projects that in 2006, it'll be 80,000 CT images per day, which is about 0.45 seconds per image. At 1 image per second, it would take about more than 22 hours to review the images. Keith had a really dramatic slide about their increase in volume of studies, but if you actually plot the number of images that we're creating, even just in CT, the increase is far more dramatic than the increase in the volume of studies. And it's not just CT. For general radiography, we routinely are using dual energy subtraction in every single chest radiograph that we do currently, which has doubled the number of images. We're getting into looking at temporal subtraction, which will also increase the size of general radiography studies. Tomosynthesis, where we acquire multiple images for a chest radiograph at different angles or for a mammogram, again, increases the number just for general radiography. You're familiar with MR functional data sets that are getting more and more complex, and MR sequences are getting more complex also. Cardiac angiography is generating huge amounts of data, and CT, as you know, in the next few years will be moving to flat panel detectors, which will require tremendous amounts of storage and tremendously large channels of information to acquire parallel data very, very rapidly. What are strategies that people have been using just to cope specifically with CT? Well, most places are still, even though they have the 16-channel scanners, they're still reconstructing thick sections for their PAC systems because their PAC systems just can't handle doing the reconstructions currently at the workstation or handling all those images. It creates some problems, though. I mean, this sort of paradigm of reconstructing the images at the scanner and then sending them may work for some areas, but not for others. For example, for CT virtual colonoscopy, it may be that one wants to have the CT technologist do the reconstructions, send the result of the movie to the radiologist. But for routine imaging, it just doesn't work to have this paradigm where the technologists are doing the reconstructions and then sending redundant information that's reconstructed to the radiologist. What should happen is the original data set should be available at the workstation for interaction by the radiologists. 3D imaging was once considered by radiologists to sort of be eye candy for referring clinicians and patients. But we're finding more and more that being able to see the 3D data set allows us to see oblique structures such as ribs and gives us a very rapid overview. And so what we're doing routinely is we're, in every single patient, we're looking at the 3D data set, we're looking at multiplanar images in our CT studies. The problem and challenge is we don't have any more time to read the studies, and in fact, as Keith suggests, we're doing more studies per radiologist in total, and so we have to figure out how can we look at all these different planes and all these images and still not increase the amount of time that's required to look at the studies. The other thing is we use the workstations to render specific images of the spine, pulmonary and abdominal and pelvic vasculature. A single CT of the chest and abdomen and pelvis now that we're routinely doing becomes the equivalent of 10 or 11 or 12 different subspecialty CT studies that we would have billed for and had to have read separately otherwise. We have this level of information in every single study that comes off our 16-channel scanner as we're reading on workstations that have the capability of doing 3D and multiplanar. And it raises the question of, are we now responsible for detailed reports in every single patient? Should our chest radiologists routinely comment on the renal arteries and the celiac arteries and on bulging and herniated discs, things that they can see exquisitely well now with the multiplanar images that were not quite as easy to see in the thicker axial sections. And this is creating a fair amount of consternation and debate at our facility currently. The other question is that currently most of the 3D and advanced capabilities are not integrated into PACS systems. And the problem is that in a lot of facilities, you sort of have to walk away from the PACS to the 3D workstation and then walk back. The workflow is such that you really don't have the capability of being able to compare a current and previous study on most 3D workstations. This is changing very rapidly, but if you look at a snapshot of today, most radiologists still don't have the capability that I'm talking about at their primary read workstations. What we're finding is that non-radiologists also want to have access to the 3D and multiplanar capability, and currently there's not an easy way to be able to deliver that in most facilities. We find that clinicians really use the 3D and multiplanar very, very well when we give them the capability. For example, at our facility, podiatrists, orthopedic surgeons, pulmonary physicians, and neurosurgeons all have favorite applications where they find 3D and multiplanar to be particularly helpful. And so what we want is enterprise-wide capability for 3D, multiplanar, and advanced functionality as well. I think probably the biggest challenge has been this lack of integration of 3D into the current generation of PACS workstations. So what we're finding is that radiologists are very rapidly changing from this Photoshop paradigm where they sit down, there's a workstation, they have a mouse, they have pull-down menus, they have icons. And what we need is to completely rethink the way we do the PACS workstation. We think that the controls should be much more intuitive, the same way a car is much more intuitive for a driver. One of our college students actually put this little demo together, which was really kind of fun. He's not a big fan of our PACS system, and this is sort of a brand X PACS workstation. And what would it be like if you had to drive this into work every morning, where you have to find your mouse, find your arrow, start it up, hit the start button, and now your car's going to start. And once you're started, then what we have to do is we have to start driving. So let's take our PACS workstation, and I guess we're going to have to find the accelerator and click on that. If we want to hit the brakes, it says how hard do we want to step on the gas pedal. We'll say OK. Are you sure that's a lawful speed? Yeah. System does not take responsibility. And then if we want to accelerate, we can accelerate how hard it is. And then there we go. If we had to turn right or left, I would never get it. Much better controller than a mouse or a trackball to be able to race. As a radiologist, I do not want anything that looks like this type of workstation. By the way, our college kids were not big Microsoft fans also, and so they built in a car phone, and when you go to answer it, let's speak speaking about Microsoft, Bill Gates said if GM had kept up with technology like the computer industry has, we'd all be driving $25 cars that got 1,000 miles to the gallon. And of course, GM fired back to Microsoft and Bill Gates and said, what if they designed cars like Microsoft Windows? Every time a new car was introduced, you'd have to learn how to drive all over again because none of the controls would operate the same way. The airbag would ask, are you sure, before deploying. And occasionally, for no reason whatsoever, your car would lock you out, refuse to let you in until you lifted the door handle, turned the key, and grabbed hold of the radio antenna. So how do we do it in Baltimore? Well, I'm a big believer in clients in having the 3D capability on the server side. And so we use an enterprise-wide 3D multiplanar system in which we have the PACS that provides the horsepower for advanced processing using a client-server model. And I'm going to talk about this. I think this is absolutely the only way to go in the future, and I'll talk with you why. For us, currently, each server supports about a dozen concurrent PC clients. And what this means is without having to go to thick clients or increase the amount of storage in each particular PC, we have the ability to open up a window into a central processing system that allows us to be able to just video stream out to the PCs. And so all the studies then go directly from the scanners to a central server and then are made available to any PC in the hospital that has a relatively small program that's installed on it. Why is this important? Well, what we found in our hospital, and I think is true in most hospitals, is that network speeds are increasing only very, very slowly. And this has become a huge constraint. And so as our data sets are getting larger, our ability to transfer 1 megabyte from one place to another in the hospital hasn't increased. Our typical trauma CT study at the University of Maryland is 4,000 images. And transferring those to a 3D workstation really takes a surprisingly long period of time. What we're also seeing is a new bottleneck where CT reconstruction speed has become a bottleneck. And we can reconstruct 2 images per second at our current scanner, but even increasing it to 20 images per second could take 3 minutes for 4,000 images, 30 minutes for 40,000 images that we anticipate having in the future. And so what we really would like to be able to do is to routinely process on the fly from the raw data set, not have to wait for the DICOM images to go from one place to the other, but be able to have every workstation have immediate access without having to wait for the images to transfer to that particular workstation. We just can't transfer all those to the workstations in time as they're needed. And so I think what we're going to see in the next few years are advanced display, image processing, and analysis tools, and it's all going to be done centrally. The CAD will be done centrally, advanced image processing will be done centrally, and 3D and multiplanar will be done centrally also. It's going to be much more like your cable TV on demand with controlled streaming that's interactive. And you'll be able to timeshare these network resources. And so you've got these big black boxes that will do many different features, and relatively thin clients will have access to those. You can use the model, as I mentioned, not only for 3D and multiplanar, but to share CPU and GPU, graphics processing units, available throughout the network. And I think this can become a very efficient system. And I personally think in the next few years it's the only way to go. Maybe after that, as networks get faster and clients get more and more powerful, we could rethink it. But I don't see that in the next 5 years. The next major phases in the continuing, what we call TRIP, transformation of the radiology interpretation process, are going to focus, as Keith mentioned, on decision support tools. So what do we have after volumetric imaging? Well, as I'm reading a CT that has 360 images today, it would be wonderful if things that looked like nodules that didn't connect to vessels actually appeared in maybe a little red, had a little reddish hue, for example, or spiculated lesions had some other color. And so rather than using CAD or queuing, or CAD as a separate reader, as I'm interpreting studies, I have a partner with a computer that's helping me to do analysis that I can switch on or off as I'm reading. So it becomes very dynamic and interactive, and I actually have the computer that helps me in many different ways with processing. So for reading a mammogram, I don't necessarily need it to be a second reader after I'm finished. I want it to sit right next to me and say, well, gee, what do you think about this lesion or that lesion? And maybe the color or the degree of color would be proportionate to the computer's expected likelihood that the lesion is malignant. I think other coping mechanisms will include image content-based indexing, so that I can say, look at all images like this in a large database and tell me which ones are matches. Lossy image compression, we're going to need to think about image compression. Research we've done at our facility, however, unfortunately, suggests that thinner images are noisier and harder to compress. So we need to look at technologies like 3D image compression, which I think is going to be increasingly important. And image navigation is going to improve substantially with new input devices, better navigation software, and many of you in this room hopefully will help us to be able to figure out how best to redesign the workflow, redesign the computer workstations. We're going to be using, we're going to need more and more of a mechanism to extract clinical information that's important. I have the capability with my electronic medical record of having the entire repository of everything that's been entered for the patient in the last several years. Problem is that I can't absorb all that in 10 or 15 seconds, which is all I've got, if I'm only going to spend 60 seconds reading out a chest radiograph. So I need an intelligent way to be able to organize and present that. Image subtraction and image warping would also allow me to compare current and previous studies. So just to conclude, I think these future developments are undoubtedly going to create additional challenges and concerns. And I'm hoping that many of the experts in this room and the medical imaging and medical informatics community can help us deal with this incredible onslaught of image information. And as I mentioned, although I focused on CT and diagnostic imaging, I think we're all, anybody who's a healthcare practitioner nowadays is really facing similar issues with related to information overload. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your attention and be delighted to answer questions.
So from the panel, I really liked your comics and things like that. It's good for the end of the day. As we're moving. Yeah, excellent. Well, we should have a meter vote and see who got the best humor here. Keith.
Eliot, I know your feelings on this, but maybe we just discuss it for a minute. Since there's too much data being produced, I mean, do you think any of that data is not necessary? And I guess I'm hinting toward compression. And if it is not necessary, can't we just throw it out?
So the question is, can we not just throw out the data? Can we try and figure out a way to sift through? Do we have to really save all that data?
And I say, not every other image kind of approach, but is there a logical compression you could do and maybe, have some of this data go away?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. For ultrasound, for example, as you know, the text might scan for 20 or 30 minutes, and they might only save 20 or 30 or 40 images, which is tremendous compression. In angiography, we do large angio runs, and we only save relevant images. And so I think it's true that we can do that. The problem is that it's not clear what to throw away and what not to. One of the problems that we're seeing is that we're starting to do research into CAD and compression. And one of the issues is that as we do image compression, most of the compression algorithms are designed to be visually lossless. And so what works for the human visual physiologic system may not be what the CAD program is using. And so trying to figure out what to throw away can be really, really a significant challenge. The other question, of course, is how long are you supposed to keep the data? I mean, how often do you really find useful information that's older than 6 or 7 years? But we're currently about 12 years out, and we haven't thrown away any of the data. And the question is, should it be persistent forever, or do you clinically compress older data? And we're not really sure of that. The other question is, do we need to save all the raw data sets in thin sections, or should we be saving 5mm sections? And a number of my colleagues have said, don't save the raw data. That's going to get you in trouble. I mean, it's like when we talk with the endoscopists and ask them, why don't you save the data, from your videos of endoscopy? And it's kind of funny to hear as a radiologist, but their answer is, oh, we don't want to save it because we might get in trouble, medical legally for saving it. And I'm thinking, if you're scared of being in trouble for saving it, I mean, what are the implications of we in radiology who really are mandated to save all the information that we have? So it would be certainly compelling to try to figure out a mechanism to save what's clinically relevant, to create subsets of that. I'm not sure how to do that. And until then, we're sort of erring on the side of trying to keep all the data, but trying to figure out intelligent ways to compress it, not only in a lossless manner, but in a lossy manner also. It's a really difficult question. And as we head towards these 80,000 images per radiologist per day, I think that the need to do some sort of compression is going to increase, because It seems as though we in radiology have figured out creative ways to acquire images faster than our colleagues in the computer sciences are figuring out ways to store them and to distribute them. John.
Eliot, I had this sense of one of your audio graphics, which is a wreck. There is a sort of form of car wreck emerging here, and sort of along three vectors. One is the radiologist being overwhelmed.
Right.
He's literally overwhelmed.
And we're there, we're awfully close.
There, and I'm glad I never went to medical school as a result. The second was that, I thought in my sort of limited perspective, one of the things that helped PACS was the increasing ability to leverage, quote, the normal IT infrastructure. So as the network normally got faster and the workstations got better and the internet browsers arrived, you could leverage it with sort of modest capital, incremental capital outside radiology itself. I have this sense that, in fact, it becomes more invasive of the sort of enterprise infrastructure, and you run into capital hurdles and IT agenda hurdles, et cetera. So that would be sort of second vector of train wreck. The third is to the degree that what this implies in order to cope with the first form of train wreck is significant capital reinvestment of new technologies and running into capital squeezes and tight operating margins that you hit the wall. And so, is there a sense of wreck emerging or in play? I'm just curious. It just sounds like quite the jam that's emerging.
It is quite the jam, and I think what's happening is it's an envelope that is being pushed to some extent because IT infrastructure has increased, and so radiology technology is evolving to say, oh, so you can handle the data. Maybe let's go ahead and throw a 16-channel scanner at you and a 64. So to some extent, I think as IT advances, the radiology modalities are advancing to be able to take advantage of that, and one seems to be pushing the other. I think the answer is innovation. I was talking about this sort of video streaming technology, and what we're finding is that the amount of bandwidth required to do the video streaming is substantially less than to send the images and to process them multiple ways. So this whole idea of taking 1,000.75 millimeter slices and then having the CT scanner and the text reconstruct them in many different ways and turning it into 4,000 or 8,000 images, why not just take the original raw data set, which is smaller, and then interact with it at the workstation? So what we're seeing are some innovative technologies and innovative approaches that are allowing us to not overtax what really is not a very rapidly growing IT infrastructure. And so the question is, how can we, within the constraints of where it is now and where it might be in the next few years, be able to handle it? And there are so many other things such as cable video and the need to do streaming of educational material. They're already pushing IT infrastructure, and we're hoping to stay within that constraint. So I think what's going to happen eventually is if we push too far with regard to the infrastructure, it's going to hold back to some extent development of new expectations for acquisition modalities. We have a new 64-channel scanner that's coming in. We're going to be doing cardiac imaging. And we're going to be doing multiple passes through the heart and generating increasing amounts of data, but our constraint is going to be whether we can store it, whether we can move it from place to place, and if we can't, it's going to hold us back a little bit with regard to those acquisition modalities. So it's a good point. I think that we're not going to wreck, but we may end up slowing down in traffic significantly, and these are some challenges that I'm hoping some of the expertise in the room will help us to be able to deal with.
Shankar?
I want to follow up on both questions. Another question is asked. So you really want to look at feature space extraction of these images.
Right. So that's one approach.
So and then you can do a hashing of these features, so the retrieval becomes very fast and rapid.
Yes.
And so that way your compression becomes more better tuned because you can reproduce images much more accurately than before. And that would be a way to go. I mean, in your knowledge of, taking a large volume of images and trying to see, have you come up with the strategies for creating feature space, image constructs that can be reused and recycled for imaging first?
People have been working on that for years, and what's interesting is that there are certain features that one can extract. And so if you just want to find something like microcalcifications on a mammogram, that's easy. If you're looking for spiculation, then that's easy. And there's some fairly low-hanging fruit that we've done a really good job. Tremendous work at University of Chicago and other places And so we can take that information, index it, and then translate and do searches like, show me all the images that look like this current chest x-ray, and maybe if I get lucky or if I'm smart enough, maybe those patients will tend to have the same diagnosis. The problem is that we've gotten to a plateau, at least in my opinion, where we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and it seems as though the efficacy of the CAD programs, which are pretty primitive right now, and the efficacy of our ability to do feature extraction is starting to kind of plateau off. And the question of what goes on in a radiologist's mind as we look at images, I think is incredibly poorly understood. I think we radiologists probably understand it less than anybody else, but if you actually ask what happens, it's very different. If you ask a radiologist how they read a chest x-ray, they say they go from side to side in a logical way, looking at the ribs and scanning the lungs. Elizabeth Krupinski does studies where she actually watches radiologists' eye movements with tracking, and it's almost random. It's amazing how unorganized it is, and what a miracle it is that anyone makes any diagnoses. And we did a study where we took the worst monitors in the department that you could barely read the text on, and we had radiologists reading chest radiographs and compared those to exquisitely tuned monitors that met all the specs. And amazingly, and I'm a big fan of monitor quality control, and I think my monitors should be tuned perfectly, but what we found was very little impact on the radiologist's diagnosis. And so I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what is important as a radiologist looks at a study, and feature extraction is a wonderful idea, and it's something that some really good work's been done on, and maybe in the 10, 20, 50-year time frame we'll do more. But I don't really think that we're going to be too much better in 5 years. There have been a couple companies that have sprung up predicated on doing that, and those have not really been successful. So it's a really interesting question, but I don't see that coming real soon. But maybe some other people have some other opinions about that. Thanks.
Dominic, I have another question, but I can wait till...
go ahead.
So, I mean, with reference to indexing within images,
yes.
The question that you raised. I mean, you probably are familiar with this, but I mean, a relational database like Oracle, for example, introduced recently in the last version, and we were drivers of some of these efforts in terms of indexing within images and creating image tables. Mm-hmm. So you can really do rapid searching across image tables. You can also do computations, and they put on top of that, I mean, there are people from Thinking Machines who moved to Oracle, so they put on top of that learning systems, which would do comparisons to ask the question which are similar and which are different and so forth.
Right.
And index them as tables as well. And so I don't know if you explored any of these issues with reference to sub-indexing within images and looking at comparisons and doing computational analysis of images automatically to get rules for mining.
We haven't at our laboratory, but a number of people have. It's a fascinating area, and for areas such as mammography or ultrasound of the liver, there's some really interesting work that's been done. And I would love, as a radiologist, to have that capability and be able to have the system help me with regard to decision support. And so we're looking into that, but I think healthcare really needs a big shot in the arm with regard to people who have that level of expertise, because there's not a tremendous amount of work that's being done in the radiology domain for that.
Just a little follow-up on your display capability.
Sure.
Isn't the inter-observer agreement fairly low?
Yeah, in fact, it's been suggested that it may be as low as 30, as a discrepancy rate of 30%, just reading conventional radiographs from one radiologist to the other. So that does make it a challenge.
So my question was dealing with, I'm a little intrigued on the citing your time studied by the number of images, i.e. the data versus the information content, because obviously you need more data to do 3D rendering that actually gives you more information.
Right.
I never thought of it this way, but I thought of it as an ordering provider as asking for an image-based impression, not necessarily diagnosis, but an image-based impression versus the reading of a number of slices. And maybe, what does a radiologist think?
Well, let me clarify that. The number of slices, as it continues to go up, could potentially, let's say, approach infinity at some point. And what we're advocating is the radiologist having the capability of being able to, or a clinician, dialing in whatever slice you want. So as our slices are getting thinner and thinner, some radiologists like reading 8mm slices, some 4, some 2, depends on what plane you're reading in. And so as slices get thinner and thinner, what one has is more data to be able to render as accurately as possible those images that are requested. But in general, radiologists are not reading the 0.75, 0.625 millimeter slices. They're too noisy. And so what's happening is at some point, we don't need thinner and thinner sections because radiologists don't really need thinner sections. And as you approach infinitely thin, you're just able to make very, very small increments with regard to quality of those reconstructed images. I think the most exciting thing is functional imaging. We're able to image very rapidly, repeat areas over time to be able to watch a bolus of contrast, or to be able to watch behavior of tumors, or to be able to look into the heart. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that doubling the number of slices that we have doubles the quality of information. But there's a point that we're just approaching now with this isotropic imaging where we're routinely scanning sub-millimeter that allows us to be able to investigate in any plane that we want to. And so the idea is to acquire the data set. The radiologist now can investigate the data set in many different ways. And now there's more information available in different planes to the radiologist in rendering the answer to your question. Frequently, we'll have a question that says, is this nodule that's seen on chest radiography a tumor or not? But what happens is we give contrast, we're scanning through the chest and abdomen, and now all of a sudden I notice that the patient has a left renal arterial stenosis and an extruded disc at the L3, L4 level. Question is, what do I do with that information that's sitting right in front of me on my 3D workstation? You asked me a question, I've answered your question, but now the problem is that I've acquired a tremendous amount of data that incidentally answers many other questions as well, potential questions. What do I do with that? How do I report that? What are my levels of responsibility? How long should I take looking at that information? How do I get that back to you? If I give you 8 answers to one question that you asked, how do you then deal with that information? So lots of really interesting informatics types of challenges.
It's a little like analogous to an intern is now having an EMR, and all of a sudden when you get a lab test result back, you actually can put it in context, and then you discover all these coincidental, but you discover other things because you reintegrated this new piece of information in the old, and have perused the entire data set again. That's what you did.
Right.
So, I think we have increased the workload on the intern and the radiologist, but 2, I think we've actually improved conditions for the patients. And yes, there's a reimbursement aspect to that question, but I think foremost it's actually more information that can contribute to the care of the patient.
Right. Well, in some ways, there will be a similar challenge as in family practitioners, for example, end up getting genomic information, end up getting more complex radiology information. If you have a tricorder, like McCoy, then you might have a tremendous amount of information that you get on every visit. What do you do with all that? How do you document it? How do you handle? How do you follow up? And so I gave the specific example of the radiologist day and workflow because as a radiologist, but I really think we all could give examples that were not too dissimilar, and we're all going to have to look in common to figure out how to deal with this information overload.
Okay, questions from all of you. Go ahead, first. Where's the, yeah, you.
Well, this was a nice discussion at the end, and I should say, are we sure that this multi-detector CT is not an industrial mistake? Because mixing up higher sensitivity with higher resolution, that's not what we need, because this technology will never compete with other things for higher sensitivity like PET and whatever.
Because it's anatomic.
Yeah.
Although with multi-channel CT, we can also do the functional imaging as well in a way much better. Right.
But then the answer is all these slices should never leave or go out of the scanner.
And that's an interesting perspective that some people have and would argue strongly. Some people would say that doesn't make any sense. In some ways, it almost gets back to the screening question. We talked to our thoracic surgeons, and we told them that we would offer them thoracic screening CT in all their patients. And they don't want to do the CTs on their patients because our ability to detect tiny nodules, the 2 and 3 and 4 millimeter nodules, has far outstripped the algorithms that they have to know how to deal with those. And we've told them, we can report out to you in all these patients, instead of doing conventional chest radiography, the CTs, And then we asked them, if we have this information, do you want to know it? They don't. And so they would say specifically that they don't want to hear about those nodules. And so they say, don't do the CT because we don't want to know, because we don't know how to follow up. There are medical legal implications. And I think the sophistication of our treatment algorithms has not caught up with the diagnostic information that we have.
With diagnosis.
Okay, can I just switch over and I'll come back? Dennis, and then come back here to you.
I was going to say, I hope there's no lawyers in the room. You know, as a hospital CEO, you know, when someone has a bad outcome, the first thing they ask for is the medical chart. The lawyers ask for. And it seems to me we have to find a way to separate out the clinical from the quality assurance portion of this, and you know, protect that that portion underprivileged. But I guess what I'm hearing you saying is gray between what's clinical and what's not. That's the real problem here, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a number of problems, and part of the issue is trying to figure out what constitutes the community standard for level of expectation for a typical routine study. And the new generation of CT and MR and other systems are redefining that. And it's also challenging our treatment protocols also. And there are medical legal, there are community standard issues that are related to that, absolutely. And I think we'll be seeing more and more of those outside the radiology domain as we get this type of information overload and increased information in other areas in medicine too. Keith?
One of the things I want to add to that, it makes it very complex, is at our hospital we decided to add more images from other departments. Can you hear that microphone?
Thanks.
We decided to add more images to the PACS system because we've got a PACS system infrastructure, so why not put more data there? Well, then the problem ensued was, okay, well, for example, ultrasound data coming from the operating rooms. Well, the strict policy of the operating room is to not store any images. And the surgeons are claiming that their college is saying you don't have to. The radiologists are claiming that their college is saying you do have to.
Yeah.
The exact same device used the exact same thing in different studies by different person, but the policy hasn't changed.
And the reason, I mean, it's not only you don't have to, it's we prefer you not. That's right.
Right. And so I think the advent of these other devices that will be used more and more, and ultrasound coming down to a device like this size, then the question really becomes, is it the device that's going to control it? Is it the use? Is it the user? Is it the application? And so it's going to get far more complex.
In some ways, it's almost like asking the question, do you want, as a family practitioner or internal medicine person, to have a videotape every time you interact with a patient and to have that videotape of your entire interaction saved? Or do you want to have a surgeon have a videotape preservation? If we have the archive capacity and the storage and the capability, then should we be archiving and saving every surgery? And I can tell you practically every surgeon would say no. And so what is our level of responsibility in radiology now that we're getting these immensely complex data sets?
We'll end up with, instead of an autopsy on the body, we'll end up with an autopsy on the digital information.
And we're doing that more and more. I mean, and there have been a number of articles that have looked at multi-channel CT as an autopsy substitute.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, I agree that saving the raw data would, of course, be a nice solution. But there is a problem, I think, in that the format of this data is usually quite proprietary, and
Absolutely.
the algorithms you use to reconstruct. So what is very often done is you save a high-quality format on the scanner, a low-quality format for diagnosis, and go back for referral to the modality. Now, if you could save the algorithms with the raw data in a way that you could use it even years afterwards to reconstruct, that would be, of course, a good solution. In that case, we would have to push for something like a standard extension to do this.
Right. The problem is that a lot of it is specific to the mechanism at which the detectors acquire the information. But I've talked to a couple of third-party vendors who have said that they're planning on getting into just that space. And then I've talked to some CT manufacturers that say for their own scanner, they want to have the capability of being able to serve up the raw data set and have the workstation interact with it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's the temptation as time goes on to do just what you said and have some sort of DICOM standard specifically to describe the mechanism at which the raw data is acquired so that one might be able to apply generic software to be able to interact with it.
Over here.
Yes, I was wondering if you had any solutions to silicosis and asbestosis and monoconiosis medical records that need to be saved for 30 years, whether or not the entire image set would need to be saved for that period of time. It's 30 years post-employment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that the technology is here such that the amount of storage required to do that is definitely here, and the amount of data that we're acquiring is a relatively small subset of that, but it raises a great point. How long should we keep mammograms? How long should we keep pediatric images? And now that we have the capability to save images, how do we do that? The other thing that we're beginning to see are some of the companies that were doing archival are going out of business. And so who owns those images, and who has that level of responsibility? And if you acquire an image on a patient, do you have that responsibility forever to keep their images? And the same is true of the electronic medical record. And so what is that responsibility, and should that vary from time to time, or should patients take some responsibility? And should there be third-party companies that come up and say that, you know, we will store and save your images so that you, the patient, can be empowered to do that? It's a good question, and it's not clear that there are any legal answers to that. But at least for chest radiography, I think the technology is such that those are relatively small, and we have the capability to store those. David?
Notwithstanding the point we talked about where the line goes through zero, where some specialists don't want to keep any images, have there been any comparative studies between people who are ultimately doing the study and going to be acting on it, say interventional radiologists or a cardiologist, in terms of the amount of data that they store, i.e., is it time that we have to start thinking about process changes so that people who are acquiring the images and things, rather than just storing it and banking it and looking all over the place while we're there out of curiosity, that we're actually answering the clinical questions in parallel as we go along? Have there been those kinds of studies to compare storage utilizations, recognizing that there's a group that doesn't want any?
Not that I'm aware of. In fact, right now, there are no standards or recommendations that I know of other than for diagnostic radiology. And you're right, within diagnostic radiology, there are no specific recommendations for how many images from an angiogram that you're supposed to keep or how many images from ultrasound. There are not even any specific recommendations for compression. And so there's no rationale at this point. The American College of Radiology just says that compression is okay and should be done at the discretion of the radiologist. And I think radiology is only a small subset. I mean, how much of the electronic medical record should be kept? And should there be hospital local policies, or should these be national policies? And right now, if you go to the medical legal system, it's, you know, the community standard is what one is held against. But the community standard is changing fairly rapidly. At our facility, we've had discussion about having a medical imaging committee to look at issues such as what should be stored and what shouldn't, what is an acceptable level of compression, the whole issue of monitors. I mean, you know, we saw some really interesting dermatology images, but control of the quality of the color and display is really, really tricky. And so who should determine how long those images are kept? Who should be responsible for doing the quality control? Should it be IT? You know, IT would say, well, they really don't have the clinical expertise. Should it be radiology by virtue of training, or how exactly should that work? So I'm not aware of any studies, to your question, that have looked at what should be stored and what shouldn't, and to establish either local hospital or community standards. I think you'd find that it varies amazingly from one place to the other. And even in a somewhat homogeneous system such as the Department of Veterans Affairs, there are no rules and regulations that go across from one facility to another making those recommendations.
And this is going to get even worse with whole slide imaging and pathology, generating 10 or more times the amount of data as a diagnostic imaging department.
For telepathology, yes.
Or even for general examination, even beyond that, sure. Questions here? Go ahead.
It should be very interesting to really understand how the process of making a diagnosis is being done by the radiologist. If you compare it to the interpretation of an ECG by a cardiologist, he only needs a fraction of a second to just see what the diagnosis is.
Right.
So are we doing a good job in trying to measure the picture and making an ontology of it, and trying to extrapolate a diagnosis if it is really only a kind of pattern recognition in a graphical way?
Right. Well, and it's a great question. You know, radiologists will tell you, chest radiologists will tell you that they have a gestalt, and if you do eye tracking, what you see is that the radiologists do a gestalt on the entire image and then focus on very specific areas. And what's amazing when you do the eye tracking studies is the tiny little nodules or the pathology, there's some magical way that experienced radiologists' eyes go to focus on that within a very short period of time. One interesting experiment that we were hoping to do was to actually take radiologists and put them into a functional MR scanner and actually do an experiment to see what areas of the brain are activated as they do certain types of tasks. And it's sort of like an Alice in Wonderland, you know, looking into a mirror that's looking into a mirror that's looking into a mirror type of experiment. But it raises a really interesting question, and that is, to what extent can we radiologists be helped by machine systems in the future, not only to allow us to cope with information overload, but to make a more accurate and earlier diagnosis? And right now, I think we're just at the earliest, most primitive stage. What's really exciting is that the advent of digital technologies have created the party. And the party allows us now to be able to employ all sorts of different digital technologies and bring them to bear on what was normally just a gestalt manual type process. And where we're going to be in the next 5 years or 20 or 50 years will be really, I'll be fascinated to see that. There's more and more work that's being done. And your point's well taken. I already know that I can be outperformed for finding microcalcifications on a mammogram by the computer. The computer can find nodules in a chest CT faster than I can, although it finds 3 or 4 to 1 that are false positives in comparison to me. The systems are getting better all the time, and I think it's going to be really exciting. And again, I'm hoping that some of the expertise in this room can be brought to bear to help us deal with the information overload and to make better diagnoses also. And of course, the risk is that if I'm looking at 80,000 images in a day, if you take me back to image number 37,348 and you tell me I didn't spend very much time and I missed something, you know, I mean, there's certainly the question of how many images can you actually look at and still maintain a level of accuracy.
Well, Jeff is going to take his shot at giving you some of that expertise.
Excellent.
Oh, yeah, I have an answer for what you know I don't. From an image processing point of view, we've talked a lot about informatics, but you know, image processing point of view, what do you see as like the major stumbling blocks that are, you know, could open things up in the next 5-10 years? Well, if we could solve these problems, medical imaging would really have a much larger impact.
Well, I think one of the stumbling blocks until recently has just been raw processing power. For example, I can do windowing and leveling through the contrast domain. So I can window and level currently as I'm looking at a chest radiograph and change the brightness and contrast interactively. But wouldn't it be really cool if I could change the spatial frequency? So if I can say, give me certain narrow areas of spatial frequency on a mammogram, if I had a window and level for that, I might be able to enhance the microcalcifications. There have been some really interesting work that was done at Duke on iterative processing for chest radiography, where the quality of these portable chest radiographs with these very complex iterative processing techniques was improved significantly. The bad news is it took 3, 4, 5 hours to actually do some of the processing. And so can we either at the client itself or centrally be able to do some more sophisticated processing? Nuclear medicine already benefits tremendously because it's so information starved with regard to statistical amounts of information. Can we begin to bring into bear some of the incredible work that's been done in the intelligence area or in space exploration and bring that to bear in medical imaging? So I think having solutions to being able to have more processing power would be something that would occur to me right away. And then the types of databases that everybody was talking about this morning and early in the afternoon, where we can begin to associate the electronic medical record with findings on radiography and being able to have automated systems, not just to sift through and sort out genotypic information and correlate it with imaging findings or phenotypic, but to begin looking at higher order information that may be in the images so that we can design algorithms that would allow us to be able to find pathology more rapidly. Again, I think we're just scratching the surface. The liver texture changes in patients with certain types of liver diseases. It might preclude us from having to do biopsies in patients who have hepatitis C, but figuring out how to do that segmentation and texture and tone processing rapidly and quickly and be able to quantify that is going to require some work. Being able to do functional cardiac imaging and having the computer being able to do some of the things that we can already do in nuclear medicine and automate that process would be fantastic. We can't even currently take a contrast-enhanced CT of the brain and separate out the vessels from the bones. You can have a tech manually do it. It might take a half an hour. There are some algorithms that come pretty close that may bring it down to 3 or 4 minutes. But I think there needs to be a lot more research done in segmentation, texture, tone, and there are a lot of really good people working on that. And one of the problems that we have is that a lot of basic scientists are starved for clinical information or clinical images. So there are researchers, I'm sure here at the university and many other places, that have fantastic ideas but just don't have access to image data sets. So one of the projects I'm working on with the RSNA is a project called MERC, Medical Image Resource Center, that hopefully will make large data sets available. One of the things that slowed down CAD development has been the problem of you've got a lot of fantastic scientists who don't have access to CT images that are thin section with lung nodules. And so those are just some of the first things that come to mind as far as what I'd like to see to be able to significantly further the ability to take advantage of computer processing to be able to enhance my ability to make an earlier and more accurate diagnosis.
I just want to mention that Jeff is leading a group that's planning a meeting in roughly the fall related to, call it grand challenges in mathematical processing of images. So very interesting possibility of interchange here that might really work. There was one question back here, and that's going to be about it, unfortunately, time-wise.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question, or sort of a longer comment, and then a question at the end of it about the 3D. I guess the comment is just, let's go back to your car example. Cars have kind of got a lot more advanced. They all have CPUs or multiple CPUs, and they're taking in lots of data. And because as more and more kind of sensors or more sensors are available in the car, the interface hasn't really changed, and it allows for a sort of a state of flow. You're still working kind of not at a really cortical decision level, but just a little bit beneath that, sort of like a routine procedural intelligence we have in our muscles, muscle memory, some people say.
Right.
And as like the data has been coming in, car manufacturers haven't provided a lot of that in your face, but they've introduced some really good things like stability control. So that's kind of taking active measures to enhance your driving. So I think the same things, like people will gladly and will need to trade off control for power. And so these technologies that we're developing will have to be designed to be non-invasive, supportive, and considerate. And it's kind of really basic principles there. So, but one of the things that you do when you're driving is you're in a state of flow. You kind of know you're working with the controls and you're taking in information. You have really quite relatively simple goals, but you're able to get into the state and not leave it. And I know with 2D imaging, like I've seen radiologists in the state of flow of just working through the imaging set, and anything that disrupts that is extremely intolerable. What have you seen so far with 3D? So the really basic question. In terms of that, being able to enter that state, not having to take too much action and sort of whispering to the system where they're going, and then with the system taking them there, and without having to kind of spend half an hour to make a diagnosis.
I think the answer to that are going to be intelligent wizards, so that if I'm looking at a pulmonary angiogram, CT pulmonary angiogram, and I'm looking for blood clots in the lungs, then the computer would realize that there are certain mechanisms, for example, something called the paddle wheel technique or other advanced visualization techniques that will allow me for that particular diagnosis to be able to maximize my likelihood of being able to find the blood clots. And so I think as time goes on, the basic tools will be there, and there should be wizards that will allow me to smoothly interact with the computer. And these will be features I can turn on and off, and I can go into manual or automatic mode. One of the things that's been really interesting that I didn't have time to talk about is that we've written auditing tools. And so as radiologists are sitting at 3D workstations, there's some interesting questions. How much time do they spend in one plane versus the other? Can you anticipate the next thing that a radiologist is going to do if they do action A and B? Is it likely that they're going to do C next? How thick of planes do radiologists like to look in? How fast do they move from one to the other so you can design video cards that would at least have some overhead faster than what they want? So we've collected tremendous amounts of data while we watch the radiologists as they watch the images. And I think it's going to be real important as we design systems in the future, not to do it in the same vacuum that some of the earlier PACS systems were designed in, but to be able to take advantage of a large knowledge base and being able to mine that database so that we know how radiologists behave. And not just radiologists, but this could be applied to how people use the electronic medical record. I want to watch as users use these intelligent systems, predict what they're going to do next, and predict what things I can do to anticipate repetitive actions that they do or strategies that allow them to be able to be faster and more accurate. Create sort of wizards and templates that facilitate that. I'd love to see that in my car, but if you design it in my car, I want a little button that lets me turn it off, like cruise control. I don't want to have a cruise control that stays on all the time, but I'd like to have it disengage when I hit the brakes. And like the same thing for some of these intelligent systems as I'm reading through a radiology data set also. So thanks for the comment and question.
Eliot, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to do a little bit more change here to make your day better. Several things. One, we're going to take a quick break meeting. It ends at 3:30. So it gives you a chance to stand up, stretch, and if you want to just grab a quick coffee. Secondly, we're going to cut the group discussion down to about a half hour. And what I'm proposing to do is drop the summarization, and rather we do it as a group. Like, what did you learn out of today? What were the big messages? I'd like to get around as many people as possible to quick messages on that. And then